Everybody should be open in their notebook to the next clean page, not a random one. And your textbook should be open to page 184. Page 184 in your textbook. A new clean page in your vocab notebook in the social studies section. The title of these notes is Chapter 6, Lesson 2. I think this is Chapter 6. Are we in Chapter 6 or Chapter 4? Chapter 6. Okay. Which is called Early History of the Southeast, and then we have the date, May 3rd, 2021. And when we get to it, we're going to start with number 1. Whew. I know there's a glare here, but it's in your book, sorry, on page 184. It just says Chapter 6, Lesson 2, the date, and early history of the Southeast. Now that we know exactly how to read a timeline, let's look at the timeline at the top of page 184. When does this timeline start? Zadie?
In the 1500s.
In the 1500s. Where does it end? Cullen?
And the 800s.
Nope. Michaela?
It ends now.
It ends in the present, which also means
Right now.
right now. It ends now. Bless you. So it starts in the year 1500 and it ends in the present. Remember, when you're looking for where a timeline starts and ends, you're looking for numbers like these in the red bubbles. Do you see the difference? So do you see the red bubbles? That's what tells you where the important eras. What was the earliest event that this timeline lists? Lena.
The first European settlement is built in the southeast.
When did that happen?
In 1565.
So in 1565, the first European settlement is built in the southeast. Were the Europeans the first people in the southeast? Who do you think were the first people in the southeast? Victoria. What? Not African Americans. Mason? Indians, which we call them. Aaron? Native Americans. Native Americans were here first. That's why they're called Native Americans. But the Europeans first settled in the southeast in the year 1565. Without looking. You may not know this. You probably don't. That's okay. Who knows what the first settlement in the southeast was? Does anybody know that? You might not. Maybe you go to the beach there. Maybe you don't. It's not Destin. St. Augustine. That's where I used to go to the beach. We'll read a little bit about it. And what happened next? Mason. It's a tough. Civil. There you go. When did that happen?
1861.
So in 1861, the Civil War begins. Then what happens? Zari.
The Civil War ends.
When?
1865.
So in 1865, the Civil War ends. How long did the Civil War last? Michaela?
4 years.
4 years. How did you know that?
Because you have to count in the middle of 1 and 5.
So you have to count from 1861 to 1865. You can count up. So 1861,
1862, 1863, 1864, and 1865.
So how many years did the Civil War last?
4 years.
4 years. You could also subtract. You could count up like that since it's less than 10. Or you could count back from 1865. Or you could do what? How could you subtract to find the answer? Carla.
The way you will subtract is we will write down 1865. Underneath 1865, we'll put down 1861 and subtract it.
So we could either count up or count back. In this case, it would be easier to count up or count back because the years aren't that far from each other. But if they were far from each other, we would take the larger year and we would write it first, and then we would subtract the lesser year from it. Okay, go ahead and begin reading on page 184. Smith, loud and slow. Zari, she's just going to read all of page 184 if you can't hear.
Early history of the Southeast. You are there. The year is 1500. While others are bringing the huge tree trunk into the village, you search for dry twigs to fuel a fire. You're going to help make a canoe. Over many days, you and some other villagers will slowly burn and scrape out the inside of the tree trunk. When the canoe is finished, it will be used for fishing and for traveling to nearby villages.
So, back then, did they drive cars or trains?
No.
Could they go to the store and buy a canoe like we can? So if they wanted to travel anywhere, they either had to walk or go on a canoe. But before they could go on a canoe, they had to actually make it. They had to take a tree, cut it down, cut off the top, smooth it out, take all the bark off, carve out the inside of the canoe, burn it so that it was smooth, and then eventually they could take it. Can you imagine having to do all of that just to go visit a tribe a little ways down the river, a few miles down the river from you? Can you imagine having to do that? That's what they had to do. Yes, Mason, quickly.
Was George Washington in the Civil War?
No, it was the Revolutionary War. Yes, Cullen.
Could they swim?
I'm sure they could. Okay. Thank you, Smith. Michaela, read next.
Early peoples. In the 1500s, Native Americans were living in all parts of the Southeast. The
Use the pronunciation key.
Powhatan
Good.
lived near the coast.
So did they live towards the Mississippi River? Where did they live? They lived close to what? Zari?
The Cherokee?
Where did they live? It says it said the Powhatan lived near the coasts. Where did they live, Zari? What did they live near?
The Everglades.
Not the Everglades. Kind of, but there's something specific. Smith?
The coast.
What coast? The coast of what?
The southeast coast.
The coast of what? Cullen?
The coast of Mexico.
Nope, that's the Gulf of Mexico. What is the coast? What does the coast mean? What is a coast? Lena?
Water.
Come on, guys. We've been talking about this since the very first chapter. Coast is not water. What is a coast? It's going to take way too long because it was a long time ago and we've been talking about it a lot since then. It's going to this is a word you should know without having to look back because we've said it several times in every single chapter and in most lessons. What is a coast? It's going to take way too long to go back and look. Zari?
An island.
Nope. Carla?
A border.
What kind of border? It's going to take way too long to go back because it was a long, 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 long time ago in chapter 1 or 2. But we've also said it every single chapter since then and almost every single lesson. Look in your glossary. You should already know this. We should already be moved on from this question. We should already be reading. This is the problem. This is why it takes us so long to finish anything. Make sure that you're in the glossary. I don't even know if they even consider it a vocab word because it's a word you should already know even coming into 4th grade. So it might not be in the glossary because it's a word that you should already know. Yes, Mason?
Is a coast something that blocks out water?
No. It's land along a very large body of water. Well, where are we in the United States? Where are we in the United States? Mason? Look at the title of the lesson. Where are we in the United States? What is this whole chapter about that we've already done one full lesson on? Victoria? The Southeast. Think of the southeastern United States. What very, very, very large body of water is along the border of the southeastern United States? Ethan? What very large body of water is right along the southeastern United States? Nope. Oof. Nope. That was chapter 1. Carla?
The Atlantic Ocean.
The Atlantic Ocean. So the Powhatan, who lived near the coast, lived along what? Lena?
The coast of the Atlantic Ocean.
The Atlantic Ocean. See, we should have been done with that question like a long time ago because we've talked about coasts every single chapter, most lesson of every single chapter, and we know we're in the southeast. So then you think, okay, I know coast is the land along a very large body of water. The largest body of water that's near the southeast is the Atlantic Ocean. So that tells me, oh, okay, Miss Fullis is asking me to answer, they lived along the Atlantic coast. They lived along the Atlantic Ocean. I wasn't asking for they lived near the coast because that's literally what it says. What coast? Well, the Atlantic Ocean. We should have been able to get through that question like that because we've talked about coasts so many times. And we've looked at maps of the United States so many times since we were little. And we should know by the 4th grade that the Atlantic Ocean is on the eastern coast of the United States, both from 4th grade and from looking at maps of the United States since we were very little. So we should have been done with that question in about maybe 30 seconds, about 6 or 7 minutes ago. This is why it's taking us so long to do these lessons. Because you are not focusing and you are not paying attention, and all of these lessons in every single class build. That means you take what you learn in one lesson and you keep it in mind for the next one. And sometimes you have to wait 3 or 4 lessons, but it's going to come back. You can't just forget about it because we're on to a new topic. Knowledge builds on itself. You have to remember what you already learned in order to learn new things. Your brain isn't like a cup of water where it can only fill so much and then it starts overflowing. That's not how your brain works. Your brain can hold it all. You just have to let it. You can't just say, okay, I don't need that anymore. I'm going to take it out. That's why you've got to focus and listen. We should have been done with that a long time ago. So I don't know if we're going to have time for Ella Enchanted, because we just had to spend 7 or 8 minutes talking about something that should have taken us 30 seconds. So those are the consequences. Okay, keep going, Michaela.
The Cherokee had settled in the Appalachians. The Shawnee, and other tribes had made their homes west of the mountains.
So remember, the Appalachians is that large chain of mountains that goes through the northeast and the southeast. We're not talking about way out west. We are only talking about the southeast right now. We see it in the title of this lesson. We see it in the title of this chapter, which is the southeast. So west of the mountains means probably between here, where we are now, and like eastern Tennessee, where the Appalachians are. Okay, read next. Lena.
Village life.
A little slower.
Most Native Americans of the Southeast build villages along rivers or lakes.
A little slower. Why would they build their villages along rivers or lakes? Zadie?
Because their food besides crops are fish.
Okay, so they ate a lot of fish. Why else do you think? Mason? So they can get water to drink. Why else? Victoria?
They didn't have shower jackets, so
They could bathe. Why else? There's one big reason I'm looking for. Zari?
I have 2.
Okay.
The first one is there's a lot of trees, so they can make their canoes.
Okay.
And the water, because the water, you can get there. You don't have to push your boat all the way into the water.
Okay. Zadie?
And because if you're by a river or lake, there's going to be good soil to grow crops.
Okay. Well, think about what was the quickest way to travel anywhere back then? Lena?
Ship.
A ship or a boat?
Boat.
So it would be a lot easier to get from place to place if you live right near the lake or the river. Because yes, you can walk there. They did not have horses yet, because remember, those came from the Spanish later on. They did not have horses yet, so they either had to walk or they could go by boat. It was a lot quicker and a lot easier to go by boat, because for a lot of a boat trip on a canoe, do you have to paddle all that much except to steer yourself? What moves you? Cullen?
Water.
The current of the water moves you. You just make sure you're going in the right direction. Okay, keep going.
They use these waters to provide fresh water, food, and transportation routes. In their canoes, they often travel great distances to trade. They used wood from forests to build their homes. The Cherokee
Wove.
wove branches together to make frames that they
converted. There's no N or T. Cover it.
Covered
There you go.
with mud or clay.
Okay. Mason, read next.
Everyone in the village had a job. The women grew corn, beans, and squash. They wove baskets from plank board. They used baskets for collecting and storing crops and for gathering acorns and other wild foods.
Okay. Zari, read next.
While the women did most of the farming and gathering, the men hunted and fished. They carved stone, wood, and bones to make tools and weapons. They used the weapons to hurt wild deer, turkeys, and other animals. They also made nets for catching fish.
Okay. So, how were the jobs of men and women of the very early Southeast different? Aaron?
Women
Louder,
did-
louder, louder.
Women did most of growing the crops and most of the work. And the men hunted and fished and they carved and they made ropes.
Good. So the women did most of the work within the village. The men, so they did most of the farming and the gathering. They grew the crops, they harvested the crops, they gathered things like nuts and berries from the forests. The men did most of the hunting and the building. So the men would be the ones to go out and get the meat, and they would also be the ones building. They both had jobs making things, though. The men did most of the building and the hunting. The women did most of the farming and the gathering. What did the women make? Zadie.
They made baskets.
They made baskets. What did the men make? Cullen?
Canoes.
Canoes. And what else? Mason?
Tools for hunting.
Tools and weapons. Very good. How did the Cherokee use wood? There were 3 important ways that they used wood. Zari?
One way is that they used wood to make canoes.
To make canoes. Victoria, what's another way?
I have 2 ways.
Just tell me one.
Make fires.
Okay, to make fires. There's 2 more ways then. There's 4. Cullen?
For weapons.
To make weapons and tools, and there's 1 more. Zadie?
They wove branches together to make frames. Like
For what? What were the frames for? Carla?
To make canoes.
We already, Zari already told us to make canoes. Smith?
To build the houses.
To build homes. So 4 important ways that they used wood. For fires, for canoes, for weapons and tools, and for homes. Because they didn't have bricks and things like we have now. Okay, turn the page. Kingston, please read to us about this child in history. Anyoka, good.
At age 6, many children were learning to write.
Make sure you're changing the words. Use your fingers so that you don't change the words, so that your brain doesn't read faster than your mouth.
At age 6, many children are just learning to write. Anyoka, a Cherokee, was helping to invent a writing system. Anyoka lived in the Appalachian Mountains in the early 1800s.
first written language. Anyoka helped Sequoia identify each syllable or unit of sound. The Cherokee learned it in the Cherokee language. Then Sequoia made symbols for all the syllables. Anyoka also helped Sequoia show the other Cherokee how the writing system works.
Keep going.
Thanks to Anyoka and Sequoia, the Cherokee were able to write down their stories, so there was no duplicate.
So before Anyoka and her father Sequoia came up with this written language, people were able to talk to each other. They had a spoken language. So they were able to talk to each other, they were able to tell stories, but they didn't have a written language, so they couldn't write anything down. They could draw pictures and they could paint things, but they didn't have written words like we do. So they had no way of passing down the stories other than to just tell people. But what happens to a story as it goes through person and person and person and person? Carla,
People forgot.
people forget parts of it. What else? Zadie?
It gets changed.
It gets changed. Think of when we play the game telephone. A lot of times it gets changed. Well, that was the same thing that was happening then. So they were telling these stories, but over time they weren't able to write them down, so the stories were changing. Pieces were forgotten. That's where a lot of these legends come in, because they were written stories that got changed over the years to seem bigger and bigger. So because Anyoka and Sequoia finally decided, hey, we need to figure out how to write our stories down so that people later on can read them, they went through and they created a written language. They knew the words, so they broke them up into syllables, the sounds, and then Sequoia came up with a picture or a letter or a symbol for each of those syllables. And so they knew if they read this syllable, it was the sound an. If they saw this little symbol, they knew it was the sound an. And then the next little symbol was for the sound yo. And then the last little symbol was for the sound ka. So they put all three of those little symbols together to say Anyoka. And that's how they came up with their written language. Before that, they had none. They had no books. They couldn't write their stories down. They couldn't keep track of anything. They just had to go by their words. Everybody please sit up and make sure that you're listening. This is part of the problem. Sit up, feet down. Aaron, please read next.
Colonies and settlers.
A little louder.
In the early 1500s, explorers from Spain, England, and France claimed land in the southeast. Settlers soon followed to set up colonies.
Keep going.
Early coastal settlements. Europeans built their earliest settlements in the southeast along the Atlantic coast.
Pause. Why do you think the earliest European settlements in the southeast were along the Atlantic coast? Zadie?
Because that's where they arrived.
That's where they arrived. Where were they coming from? Smith?
Spain, England, and France.
Spain, England, and France. Spain, England, and France are across what from us? They are on the other side of, Lena?
The Atlantic Ocean.
The Atlantic Ocean. So of course they're going to come across the Atlantic Ocean from, here's England, Spain, and France. They're going to come across the Atlantic Ocean, and then they're going to hit land. Do you think they're going to try to keep going inland much to settle? Or do they want to settle right there along the coast so that it's easy, well not easy, but easier to get back and forth with supplies? Colin?
Land right on the
They're going to stay on the coast. If there's nobody there already, then they're just going to say, okay, this land is ours. We're not going to go much further because we need to be close to the ocean. So that way if we need to send people back, we're already there. And when supply ships come, we can just unload them right here. Keep going.
In 1565, the Spanish
Augustine. When we're talking about the town, it's St. Augustine.
In 1565, the Spanish built St. Augustine in Florida. In 1607, the English founded Jamestown in Virginia.
So even though these two places are pretty far apart on the Atlantic coast, like one's down here in Florida, one's up here in Virginia, they're still right along the Atlantic coast. Keep going.
The French built New Orleans on the Mississippi River in 1718.
Is New Orleans along the Atlantic coast? So what do you think had happened by the time they settled in New Orleans? What do you think had happened? It's not along the Atlantic coast, and we know most of these places were. So what do you think had happened by 1718 that meant that they were settling further inland? Zari? Something like that.
I think maybe because they were starting to pack their stuff.
Okay. Smith?
I think it was because there were so many people already on the Atlantic coast that they had to move inland.
Good. It's because more and more people were coming. More and more people had already arrived in America. And so there were already settlements along a lot of the Atlantic coast. So they'd started sending explorers further west. And then once explorers had looked around and said, hey, this is a good area, then people started making settlements. Carla, stop playing with that. That's the second time I've asked you. It makes a lot of noise. I will read next. Don't zone out just because I'm reading, which I know is a bad habit that you guys learned. You need to listen and follow along. Many European settlers began to develop large farms known as plantations. So our first word is the word plantation. Make sure you're spelling it right. Oops. Plantation. And a plantation is a large farm in the South. They don't have plantations up north. They are large farms in the South. A plantation is a large farm in the South. To get workers, they forced Native Americans into slavery. So they first forced the Native Americans, but then they ran out of Native Americans. The Native Americans were getting sick and they were dying. And so unfortunately, things kept going. Oh, so slavery is making one person the property of another. So number 2 is the word slavery, which is making one person the property of another. So they started out with the Native Americans. They started forcing them to do the work so they could do it faster and so that the Europeans didn't have to do all of it. They didn't want to do it, so they made other people do it for them. But then the Native Americans started getting really sick and they started dying. So it says enslaved people had no freedom and were forced to work without pay. In time, Europeans began bringing millions of Africans to the Americas as enslaved workers. So when the Native Americans were getting sick and dying and there weren't as many as they wanted to do the work for them, then unfortunately they decided, well, you know what? We're going to go to Africa and we're going to bring them from there. And they're not going to have a choice. Okay. Victoria, read next. We're going to finish this page. We're not going to have time to do the next page like I wanted. And I don't think we're going to have time for Ella Enchanted, but go ahead. Read next.
Settlers moved west.
A little louder.
Settlers moved west. By the late 1700s, farmers and towns.
Not farmers.
Farms and towns covered the coastal plain. To start farms inland, settlers had to cross the Appalachian Mountains.
So, there's only so much room. Oh, I don't have it. I should have pulled up the map. There's only so much room between the Atlantic coast and the Appalachian Mountains. And yeah, there's a lot more of it in the southeast than there is up in the northeast. Because remember, up in the northeast, the Appalachian Mountains start really close to the coast. And then they go diagonally. So yes, there's a lot more space between the coast and the Appalachian Mountains in the south. But there's still only so much space. And like it says here, by the late 1700s, people had mostly settled down in this coastal plain. They needed more space. But in order to do that, they had to cross the Appalachian Mountains. Did they have roads and tunnels and things like we did, like we do? Were there like areas that people had used dynamite to blast through and put a road down? No. So do you think it was easy back then to go through the Appalachian Mountains to get to the other side? No. Keep going.
Few made the trip until it passed. Wait, no.
Yes.
Few made the trip until it passed, or opening between mountains was found. This pass was the
Spelled exactly as it sounds.
Cumberland Gap. In time, thousands of people used it to travel to Kentucky and Tennessee.
So, think of a mountain. Are mountains just like this? No, they're really long. Some of them have peaks like that, but for the most part, mountains are really long. And then there's another mountain here. And so it would take a really long time for people to go up this way. And this may be like hundreds of miles apart. And then it would take a long time to go this way and then over. But eventually, someone found this area right here where you could go around this mountain and then maybe around the other mountain behind it by staying on mostly flat ground. That is a pass where you can go between mountains instead of over. So once they discovered this pass, Cumberland Gap, then they found a way that was a lot quicker and easier. They could go between the mountains instead of over the mountains. Now it was still pretty high up, but it wasn't like going straight up to the top of a mountain and back. They could go through the mountains between them by using the Cumberland Gap. What Cumberland Gap? Carla.
Cumberland Gap is a path on a mountain to go through.
So it's a pass between mountains, and Cumberland Gap is a specific one. Every single pass between mountains is not called Cumberland Gap. But this particular pass that explorers found is called Cumberland Gap. And it's between Kentucky and Tennessee in the Appalachian Mountains. Yes,
Why is it called the Cumberland Gap?
because probably somebody named Cumberland helped to find it. I don't know. I don't know where the name Cumberland comes from, but it's in like northwestern Tennessee. It's near where like northwestern Tennessee, northeastern Tennessee, southeastern Virginia. Northeastern Tennessee, southeastern Kentucky, and southwestern Virginia all meet. That's about where Cumberland Gap is. Okay. Go ahead and close your books. We have like 10 minutes to pack up.